Today is October 12th, 2016. I am local historian Tom Arnold interviewing Jerry Cooley at the Lawrence Public Library for the City of Lawrence Fair Housing Ordinance 50th Anniversary Oral History Project. At the time the ordinance passed in July 1967, Mr. Cooley was serving as the Assistant City Attorney for the City of Lawrence. Mr. Cooley, please tell me a bit about your background and what you were doing in Lawrence in the mid to late 1960s.
I returned from the military in 1959, finished law school, joined with Milton Allen, an attorney in his practice of law. Milton became the city attorney sometime in the 50s. During the times that you mentioned, we were in a period of conflict, may I say, and from two directions. Number one, there was the race issue, the unrest that accompanied that. Number two was the Vietnam War demonstrators that came from all over the world, literally, to be in Lawrence, Kansas at that time. I was kept busy running around town to see where the fires were and what we needed to do, if I could assist in resolving some issue or halting some problem that the city was engaged in. I prosecuted truckloads of people, I suppose would be a fair way to put it. The old police station was just down the street to the south here, where the fire station and senior services center is today. There was a place on the second floor for the holding of prisoners. There were, I believe, 2 big cells there. Generally, I was at the call of the city manager, who at that time was Buford Watson. Earlier in that same early period, there was another city manager. Buford got in right in the middle of things and did a very good job, I might say, in trying to soften the impact on the community. I would, as I say, I was up practically every night. I roamed the streets in my car. I walked, I rode with the police, wherever they thought that I might be of some benefit. A lot of it wasn't fun. Some of the tactics I saw were used by the North Koreans. They strung piano wire in the alleyways from trees to tree at about neck level. I suppose they were trying to get the police or others to that they didn't approve of to pursue the alleyway as an exit or an entrance and cut their necks. Fortunately, that was discovered very early. We had no interest in that. We had a lot of violence, and the high school seemed to be a focal point for the racial issues at that time, although there were certainly bigger issues than just the high school involved. There was housing, employment, education. We had a very small African American community in Lawrence at that time. Of course, Lawrence was quite small at that time. I'm guessing less than 20,000 people. It may have been even under 15,000, but anyway, it was a small percentage of the African American community who lived here. The job itself was all encompassing. It was to give advice to the police, to the city manager, to the city commission. It was to deal with those who were actively involved in the demonstrations. We were very fortunate. We had a highway patrol colonel, he was the chief of the highway patrol at the time, who came to town and actually got out and walked the streets and mingled with those who were in the demonstration mode at that time. He softened the impact a great deal, at least during the time that he was working the streets, so to speak. I could go on and on, I guess, but
Right.
it all leads to the same issue. What did we do ultimately, I guess?
Yeah, let me ask you, you said you had come back after serving in the military in 1959. Had you been in Lawrence before that? Did you grow up in Lawrence or go to
No, I
KU
grew up
as an
in
under?
Oklahoma City,
Okay,
which gave me probably a different perspective of particularly among the racial issues than other people who had not lived in the South. Even though it was not the South, it was sometimes worse conditions than existed in the South. I lived in Georgia. I served in the Army at Fort Benning on 2 different occasions, and got a real experience of my life there. But coming back, I had a feeling for what the racial issue was, because I had witnessed the no black person can sit beyond a certain seat in the bus, in the streetcar, and the white people were not supposed to go back to where the black people were seated. That was something that bothered me and a couple of my buddies. We were 8, 10, 11 years old, I suppose. But we challenged that and stepped to the back of one of the streetcars, and we were ostracized by the conductor immediately. But anyway, we did it. I remember what bothered me a great deal was that in downtown Oklahoma City, there were a few restaurants where they had it was not drive-in, but it was walk-up type restaurants. And people could go inside to eat after they were served or sit outside. But the colored could not go inside. They had benches for them. I wasn't an activist by any means, but I did wonder why we had such a rule. I left KU. I was commissioned in the infantry in 1954, and went to Fort Benning on my second time. The South was unbelievable in those days. You may have been there some yourself, but I thought the government could have saved a great deal of money if they hadn't had so many different water fountains for whites, blacks, enlisted officers, women, men. Same thing for toilets. They were all over. We had my class at Benning. On my second tour there, I don't remember that we had any diversity. We had maybe 150 of us that were in a particular class. That's about my background. As I say, I think I have a feel for different aspects of the race issue, particularly having lived in these 2 foreign, I will say foreign places.
Right.
They certainly were foreign to me. I had not been out of the state of Oklahoma until I came to Oklahoma, to Wichita to attend high school in 1945. My dad was transferred, and we moved into an entirely different community atmosphere.
okay, great, interesting. Those are useful perspectives. From the time you came back to Lawrence in 1959, or at the time you came back, how would you describe the types of discrimination that you found in Lawrence?
Well, the obvious were in the restaurants and theaters, and it's something that's often talked about, but we had 4 theaters, as I recall at that time, 4 public theaters. In the balconies, particularly at the Jayhawker, I remember the African Americans, the minorities, were put in the balconies. They weren't allowed to sit downstairs. The same thing existed in the other theaters. For some reason, the Jayhawker came to mind. Witnessing that, there were a lot of exchanges between the 2 levels in the theater by the people. Some were for and some were against what was going on. I had to feel uncomfortable about that because it later led to some significant impact between those who were in favor of the racism and those who were not.
So over the course from the time you returned in 1959 to start law school through the kind of very tumultuous, even violent times you described at the beginning, which I assume kind of set in the late 1960s, how did you see things evolve in terms of race relations during that decade? Did just kind of tensions gradually build over some of these practices?
Let me correct myself. I returned to Lawrence in 1957. I graduated from law school in 1959.
Okay.
I made a misstatement there. I'm not sure that anyone recognized a slow process that was evolving. Obviously, the housing issue was significant, but there weren't any rental places to speak of. I returned to go to summer school in 1957, and the wife and I had a very difficult time. We finally found a 400 square foot basement apartment that was infested, but the price was right for $50 a month in those days.
Interesting.
But that was there was no significant rental market here in town at that time. You could get a room in a boarding house or in one of the old homes over in the west part of town. Those facilities weren't available to me, and I'm sure they weren't available in any greater number for the African American. There were ways that I remember that landlords, agents, those who were renting properties and even selling properties attempted to control who they rented to. One way would be that they'd make a telephone call in response to an ad in the paper and make an appointment with the representative of the owner to view the property. Well, the owner would drive up within a half a block or so and see who it was. If it happened to be somebody of color, then they'd go on and would not show up to show the property. Obviously, that couldn't be tolerated. It wouldn't be tolerated today. Secondly, there was the problem that in the mixed marriage situations, and that has continued on even but no somewhat recent times, where a white woman, a black man would be married. The white woman would respond to an ad for a rental of a property, sign an agreement, and then show up to move in, and the two of them, the black man and the white woman, were present. It could have been a white man and a black woman, but basically it was a white woman and a black man in those days. That threw a lot of the landlords, the renters, the rental companies into reaction that was really not very good. And as I say, that's even happened while I was still toward the end of my tenure as city attorney. We had cases involving the particular aspect of mixed marriage.
Right. And what year was that you finished your tenure, just to put in perspective on the time?
I retired from the practice and as city attorney in January of 2012,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Roughly 5 years ago.
So the issues certainly have persisted in some form, well past the time frame we're talking about.
We had litigation going on.
Interesting.
Involving that.
Do you recall the Jayhawk plunge swimming pool protests in 1960? And was that kind of the first really visible protests against discrimination? And do you recall how the community reacted to that?
I recall it very well. The Jayhawk Plunge was a private pool and had a big fence around it. People of color or no diverse groups were permitted to be admitted, although I think some did climb the fence in the late hours of the evening, early morning hours, and take a free plunge. But it was a debatable issue. The city was sought to solve the problem by building a pool. There was at least one, maybe two votes that where the pool issue was rejected. Ultimately, there was a passage of an issue at election time, and the city commission then proceeded to find a way to finance the pool and, in fact, build it. It's not a misconception, but it's an overlooked fact that there was a public pool before the current outdoor facility was built. At the northeast corner of 23rd and Iowa Street, back before the public pool was built, there was a private club which had been developed by a couple of local developers. They sold that interest to a client of mine that happened to be out of St. Louis who owned motels and hotels. And I talked with these people in St. Louis and the others that were involved. I think there was somebody out of Topeka, maybe an accountant out of Topeka. Anyway, the group agreed that the city could lease the pool for the remainder of whatever season it was. It was sometime in the 60s. And that was open to everyone. So that gained some time, some relief from the antagonism that surrounded this issue for the city to get the pool built over for one period of time, one closure to the next year when they opened. So that greatly relieved a lot of the stress.
Right. I don't know whether you're familiar with a book by Rusty Monholland called This is America, the 60s in Lawrence, Kansas, but he wrote a description of that decision by the city to rent the pool, and his version of it is that the city, that there was pressure from, I think it was high school, African-American high school students over some racial issues, the lack of access to a pool being one, and that there were even threats of violence, and so the city acted kind of under pressure to rent that. Do you recall any specifics of how that
I don't recall that, but it's
panned
not
out?
surprising.
Okay.
I don't think that you get anything changed that involved race
Right.
without some force coming from the opposing side.
Sure. Now, the actual passage of the bond issue, which I think was in November '67, after it had been defeated a couple of times, what do you think finally changed people's minds to go ahead and pass that?
Well, I'm not sure. Some were probably doing it because they thought it would decrease the volume of protest, of opposition. A great many, I think, decided that it was the right thing to do. And between the time I returned from the military until the mid-60s, there was an increase, substantial increase in the population in this community. And those came from outside who established their relationships, whether it was with the university or private employers. So I think those people probably had some impact on the outcome of the election.
Right.
But that's speculation. But I do know that there were a great many people, the leaders of the community, who opposed it originally and who finally said it's time to do it.
Sure. Continuing kind of along that line, what would you say were both the factors that were kind of impediments to change, and then what motivated some people, and you've already kind of touched on this, to decide it was time to get involved and take action? And who were those people who tended to get involved and join, fair housing groups and groups that oppose discrimination?
I'm not sure I have a handle on who the people were. I know some of the people who were opposed. I'm not going to mention them by name.
Right.
But,
No, absolutely. Don't expect you to mention names at all, but just kind of general social groups, I guess,
well, that's
or community
social
groups.
business. If you had a business, you engaged socially in those days. It was always somewhat the same mix of people who got together from their business and did things socially. The resistance came from a great many sides of the community. Different voices were were sounded. Some people just grew up in an atmosphere that they didn't like the colored people, but they didn't like what they did or what they stood for. Others didn't want to share what we really had as an ideal community at that time with anyone who they didn't approve of. The university faculty and students, they had a great influence on, I think, on what changes were ultimately made in the pool issue, the adoption of the ordinance, that type of thing. The university grew. When I was in school here, and I started in 1950, I don't think there were maybe 7,500 students. It increased dramatically simply because a lot of returning veterans, World War II, were still returning veterans to the campus. The Korean conflict, there were a great many who returned to the campus who had been in that conflict. So that the population of the university grew. It's not a secret that a lot of people think the university has a more liberal attitude than some of those who are on the other side of the fence. But whatever it was, I think that the university, not only the personnel but the students, had tremendous influence and impact on what ultimately resulted in the ordinance on fair housing and many other things that occurred to share what we had with other people.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I just interviewed Fred Six a week ago, and he kind of had the same perspective. He felt that if this wasn't a university town, the change would have come much more slowly and possibly much more painfully than it did.
I think that's true. And Fred and I started law school in the same year in 1953.
Really?
He had just returned from Korea and started in the summer. I started in the fall. So.
Interesting. Were you involved in any groups that were pressing for change, if not community organizations, but say through your church, or was your church involved? I know that many churches played kind of varying roles in pressing for change, or at least for fairness in community policies.
My family members were and still are members of the Congregational Church.
Which was very active, I think.
It was very active. There was a division within the ranks of the church as to what the minister was doing at the time. I recall particularly a photograph that appeared in the Journal World showing a march down Massachusetts Street toward the courthouse. And the minister at the time was noticeable in the photograph. That brought a lot of comment, pro and con. But I wouldn't call them antagonists, but those who were opposed to what he was doing certainly let him know about it. I later, at some later time, I served as a deacon of the church for a short period of time. And it was always an issue. What should the minister do and what shouldn't he do? Well, he did what he thought was right. And in those days, there were two great ministers that I had close contact with. And my attitude was that they could get a job any place, so I doubt if they were afraid of being fired.
Interesting.
They were very good at what they did.
Good. Do you recall Reverend Richard Doolin, who was at Plymouth Congregational, I think he was the campus minister?
You know, his name comes up, and I don't recall him.
Yeah, he ended up becoming the chairman or the president of the Fair Housing Coordinating Committee, which actually took the proposal to the Human Relations Commission to move forward with the ordinance.
And I'm sure I knew him and had some contact with him, but I simply can't recall. And I mix his name up with another Reverend Doolin, who's still around Lawrence.
Yes.
And at the time all of these things were going on, I recall, maybe I better recall my notes here. There was Reverend Sims. Has his name come up?
I do not believe we have run across his name.
Reverend Sims was an interesting fellow. He was not a youngster at the time I first met him. I started the practice of law in February of 1959, I don't think I'd been in the office more than a week when Reverend Sims showed up. He had a little pocket notebook that he kept, and he handed that to me, and it was asking for a contribution to his church, which I certainly felt I should do, even though didn't know where I'd get the money at the time, but I did it. And he was very active in the community and was well respected. There at the same time then came along Reverend Barbie, Reverend Doolin, and others who have had great impact on the cohesion or lack of cohesion in the divided issue
Right.
that we deal with in racism. So, but they've been very active, and I think have contributed greatly to what COM we have today.
Sure. Yeah, in doing our research, we really found that a lot of folks from the university were involved in some of these groups. Many of the churches were involved. But also you find the names, and Fred Six also kind of pointed this out, that there were certain fairly prominent Lawrence businessmen or spouses of businessmen who were involved, and often he thought their support was key to kind of bringing on more of the city establishment
Sure.
behind it.
Sure.
Do you recall any particular individuals among businessmen who played particularly important roles off the top of your head?
I'm not sure. I think Glenn Kappelman was here. Has his name come up?
Absolutely.
And Glenn was very active. He was a realtor. He operated out of an office on Massachusetts Street for a lot of years, and then became a partner in Calvinetti and Kappelman, which still exists. He had a good perspective. He had a lot of combat experience in World War II. He was from the Lawrence community, so he had an understanding of what it was about when he returned from the military. And he, in general, was in the forefront of not only the race issues, but any issues that were confronting the city. He would try to assist in any way he could. Some thought he agitated, but generally he was received as one who was trying to resolve the impact on the community that was happening.
Right. Do you recall any particular incidents or conditions that you think, in the mid '60s, before kind of the violence set in, but any particular incidents or conditions that really spurred some people to action, or was it just generally the climate and the conditions of discrimination in general that really motivated people?
Well, it's difficult to pinpoint. It's sort of like a nightmare at times.
Right, and it was 50 years ago, which is quite a while.
Yeah, even longer. But there were a lot of days without sleep, so I don't remember some.
Sure.
I think that the thing that really got our attention, or got the city's attention, was the activity at the high school.
Okay.
And I'm sure that's been gone over, but I recall being called out or being instructed to go to the high school because there was a demonstration on the exterior, but on the north side of the building as it existed in those days. And this is Lawrence High School out in Louisiana. When I arrived, I saw a lot of parents of students at the high school, many of whom I knew. I stood there for a while, and the parents were trying to get their children to break up the activity that they were engaged in, which was very vocal, very Trumpish, if that's a proper use of the time. They were vulgar.
I think that's going to be a new terminology in the
They
American
were
lexicon.
They were very disrespectful of their parents. They certainly were disrespectful of the administration of the high school who was trying to control the situation. I took sides on that as a parent. I thought that was wrong, but I was impressed that the parents were trying to do the right thing, at least what I perceived to be the right thing. Combat is never a solution, in my view, but that was one of the key things that occurred. We had We had all types of activity. We had a firebomb thrown into Judge Gray, who was a district court judge, into his living room. We had a firebomb to hit the county attorney at the house, county attorney's house at the time. We had shootings. I mentioned the barbed wire situation, which brought back my training prior to which I was getting ready to go to Korea, and the disrespect that was going on in the community was something that was quite alarming to me and to a lot of people.
Sure.
I was under personal attack by underground newspaper, by people who made threats. My wife and children lived under police protection for a period of time. There was even a period of time when we had 2 officers stationed across the street and who was in the home of Vice Chancellor Albrecht. He was the Dean of Academic Affairs for the university at the time. But they remained there and guarded and took care of my family and my home.
Right. What time frame would this have been? Was this kind of at 69, 70, the height of the violence? Or even
probably 67, 68.
Okay.
68 or
So it was
68
early as that.
really broke out.
68, yeah.
68 was a period of time I remember when Chancellor Wesco canceled the ROTC review, which was the final program for the ROTC program for the year, where students received awards, designations, whatever it might be, and commissioning ceremonies sometimes took place in those times. That generated a lot of concern for people who were not involved really in the issue of race or the Vietnam War at the time, but felt that was just wrong, and I think it stirred up a lot of problems.
Right.
Certainly in my mind at the time, I thought it was an error.
As in your position as the assistant city attorney, did you play any particular roles in that time in measures to address discrimination issues or fair housing issues in particular, or did you simply not have the tools in terms of laws to tackle those issues?
Well, we didn't have certainly the laws weren't on the book at the time that we had adopted and which have been expanded upon even up to this time. It generally was not considered our business, if you will, to get involved in real estate matters, that type of thing. Certainly, we did get involved in the restaurant issue. There was a particular business located out on 23rd Street, just immediately west of Louisiana and 23rd, which was a well-known, popular steakhouse, dance house, drinking house. And the owner of that just wasn't going to have anybody in. He wasn't going to permit people of color in his establishment. We knew the owner quite well, and Wilt Chamberlain and I came to town. Wilt had a great impact on the race relations in this community. There was a very simple statement made to the owner of this establishment that, we're going to quit coming to your business. And ultimately he backed down, and people started going. I'm not sure there was any great influx of African Americans or others who went there, but at least it opened the door. They had the opportunity if they wished to take it.
Right.
So I think that Will had a great impact in this community. Still does.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. As I recall, the state of Kansas passed a Public Accommodations Act, I think in 1959 or 1960, which was supposed to open up public businesses to integrated customers. But I recall reading about a number of businesses, roller skating rink, I think, comes to mind, that was not following the apparent direction of the law, and there was some concern at the time the law was simply too vague in terms of what all kinds of businesses that it applied to, whether they were public or private. Do you recall dealing with any of those kind of issues?
Oh, I have some recall. During those times, I think it's important to realize and to understand that this country was in turmoil for many years. We went through World War II, thought the wars were over forever. 5 years later, we're in Korea. That lasted for 3 years, and it seems like we've been at war ever since. But there was a real lack of interest, if you will, to get involved in something else that seemed to be a struggle or a fight, having gone through those 2 wars. A lot of people just sat back and said, well, the heck with it, let somebody else figure out the problem. It ultimately got our attention, of course, and I think more so because of the impact of the Vietnam conflict and the Vietnam demonstrations. But at the same time, we still had the racial issues. I'm not sure, but if the racial issues would have gotten the attention that they did without the involvement of the demonstrations against the Vietnam War, because it was a big forum then. Anybody could play, I don't like what's going on, and do something to attempt to change or alter the direction that things were being taken. So, yeah, we were scared. I think it was a scared community during the time of Vietnam and the demonstrations.
Right.
And as I've indicated, there was violence on public officials. Particularly concerned me that Judge Gray got the bomb. Truly an outstanding jurist, but it happened.
Right. Any other national events that you recall that may have had a particular impact on Lawrence and people's perspectives, whether it be some of the race riots in big cities around America or the assassination of Martin Luther King? Do you recall that had any particular impact on the community that was worrisome?
Sure. There were two major events. Kent University is still
Sure.
a front page issue.
Right.
And the Dean of Students at Kent at the time has been on the faculty. I've been on the administrative staff of the university here for many years. And I visited with him, been friendly with him, and about what went on and what he felt was happening at Kent. And then he became Dean of Students here. They expanded and gave it a title of Student Life or something like that. But still the Dean of Students, as I would recall the position. That was a significant thing. In the Vietnam War issue, Martin Luther King's death, if they thought they were going to cure a problem, whoever did this, and I have no reason to know who was the actual perpetrator or who set the thing in motion to kill Martin Luther King. But if they thought it was going to ease the pressure from the colored community, they were extremely wrong. They misjudged their opponent because all it did was bring people together. Even as hard-hearted as people are, they don't like to see people murdered.
Sure.
At least that's my observation.
Sure. Scott Wagner pointed out to me that you've lived, I think, for many, many years in the University Heights neighborhood, going back all the way to this time period. And he was just wondering whether, I assume that was an all-white neighborhood at the time, but probably had faculty members living among you. Was fair housing ever or segregation a point of discussion among your neighbors that you recall?
No, and I'm not sure it was University Heights. I lived 2 blocks west of the fountain at University. So
Okay.
if that's University Heights.
I was actually trying to figure out, there's Hillcrest Heights, I think, University Heights. So there's several neighborhoods back in there. I'm not sure I got the right name.
Yeah,
but,
that's
but
all right.
But in that area near the university.
West Hills neighborhood.
Right, West Hills,
We're
yep.
just west of that. No, I'm trying to think. I know that no one would have opposed integration into the neighborhood, at least no one I was aware of, as long as they mowed their yard and cleaned off the sidewalks and kept the place looking decent.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the perspectives of the fair housing issue is that the real estate agents were steering people away from generally all white neighborhoods because they thought the people in the neighborhoods would be strongly opposed to having African American neighbors, and they might then hurt the real estate agent's business. But at the same time, I've read things or seen things that suggest that there was actually much broader based support for, or at least no opposition to African Americans moving into all white neighborhoods. Would you agree with that perspective?
Well, certainly in my neighborhood, I don't know of any objections that existed. I'm sure in some other neighborhoods there may have been people who expressed their concern, but I don't know that it got to my attention as a legal issue. I don't recall any cases I had to defend on that particular subject.
Right. Let's shift over a little bit now towards the more the specifics. And again, I know you weren't directly involved in the passage of the Fair Housing Ordinance, but can I ask you some questions along those lines? Starting with, what was your view at the time, if you recall, of the Human Relations Commission, its purpose, and whether it was successful in moving in the direction of ending or addressing and ending discriminatory practices?
Well, I think they were addressed. I don't think it's ever ended.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So
that's a valid point. Was the membership of the council a fairly respected group of people whose efforts were credible among much of the Lawrence citizenry? Or do you think they were, some people referred to them as do-gooders who were looking for problems that didn't necessarily exist?
all of those terms have been used. They were good people. They were good citizens. They were either from the business community, university community, just the community as a whole. I would not fault any of them. They had the right attitude toward their mission that was assigned to them as a member of this particular commission. Same thing goes on today. It's not changed any. There are people who oppose it because they're told what to do to comply with the law. It seems that the older we get, the older I get, the more rebuke I see to existing laws by some people than existed in my earlier career. I'm still one who thinks if it's a law, that it's what it is. There may be unreasonable laws; those need to be changed. But the Human Relations Commission has dealt with some significant problems. It still continued to. There was, oh, heaven's sakes, help me out who the director was for so many years.
Of the Human Relations Commission?
The city organization, the Human Relations Organization. Anyway, we'll get to that. Ray Samuel, I'm sorry.
Right.
And Ray put out a lot of fires. People had no idea what he was doing. Staff did, and his bosses did, but the general community didn't realize that he solved a lot of problems, but the one-on-one conversations, did a lot of those in the evening after office hours. He had a successful career. He didn't get all the problems solved because a lot of them still exist, and they'll continue to exist as long as you've got people of opposing views.
Sure.
But it served a good purpose. I remember some of the prime objection was from employers who had a substantial number of employees, and there was a quota system, if you will. A percentage of your workforce was to be to those of of other of lesser economic means, and also of color and diversity, not just African Americans, but Mexicans, all other than Caucasian. So I heard a lot of jokes. Well, the guy came in and said you got to have 10 people of diversity working here, and he called back to the shop and would say, lay off one of them, we got too many. Well, that was sort of an attitude that existed. They were doing what they were told, but they weren't doing anything more.
Right.
I think that you go into most of the places of business today, you just see a mix of everyone working there.
Right.
But I'm sure there's still those who oppose being told what to do.
Sure. Do you recall being involved at all in the actual process of reviewing and then passing the fair housing ordinance? Do you recall consulting with the city attorney over it, reviewing the ordinance for its legal wording?
I don't recall that. I was still a youngster in the practice at that time.
Okay.
I had my hands full with taking care of those who violated our city ordinances.
Sure. Were you at least aware that it was
being
brought to the
yeah.
commission? And what did you feel like it was that the ordinance was addressing a real problem and was fulfilling a need?
Sure. We'd have, if we didn't have such an ordinance, we'd be back in the days that existed at that time,
Right.
and the ways and means that existed at that time, which would not be acceptable, and I think would lead to more violence, more outpouring of hatred, bitterness between members of the community. I think there was another important thing that took place in the same time frame, and that was the creation of the Douglas County Legal Aid Society. I don't know if that's been mentioned or not, but I know Fred Six and I and some others had impact on that. We worked to get that established, and it simply is. It's run by the law school. It was an elective course at the law school. It has represented, or the members have represented, those of diverse backgrounds, those of low income areas, and they do a good job. And it serves two functions. It serves the public, and it serves the law students, get some training in hands-on use of what they're being taught. I know that we recognized one problem before the thing really got going, that the students couldn't appear in court because they weren't admitted to the bar. So we got the Supreme Court to adopt an order stating that, with limitations, what they could do as long as they had supervision from an admitted attorney. So it has handled all kinds of realty problems, rental problems of every nature, and they still have those problems. And it's interesting to look back. I think Danelle Taha was the first director of the Legal Aid Society at the university. You know who Danelle is?
I do not.
Oh, okay. Well, she was a vice chancellor at the university. She is now the dean of the law school out in California. She was on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. She was chief judge of that group. And she's held a lot of positions and been involved in many, many things of value in this community. So she kind of got her start back here as that initial director.
Yeah, interesting. What do you think ultimately influenced the city commission to pass the fair housing ordinance?
I'm guessing. I know of one reason was that there was we knew, or the people who were involved in organizing this effort were aware that the state was going to adopt something. If I think we wanted to get a jump on that and do our own thing, if we run our own community. So that had a lot of influence on the ultimate decision by the city commission to adopt it. Secondly, I think there was an outpouring from those who thought it was something it had to be, because you at least attempt to overcome some of the significant issues raised by race, the racial issues, the economic differential between groups within the community. And we had, in those days, we had really good, really outstanding people that worked on, that were elected to the office of city commissioner. And most of them had businesses in the community and were successful otherwise. And that's not to say we haven't had good commissions since then, we have. But they felt a need, and John Emick, I think, may have been the mayor at that time.
Actually, it was Dick Rainey was the mayor.
Okay, yeah.
And he signed the ordinance. Yeah.
That's right. I saw Dick yesterday, in fact, yeah. But, and Dick was very active with these issues, and he remains so today, I think.
Right. Since you mentioned some of the individuals, do you recall, and again, I realize you weren't directly involved with the ordinance, but any particular individuals, either within city government or who may have advocated on its behalf, who you remember playing important roles in that time frame and pushing for things like the Fair Housing Ordinance? Any civil rights leaders in the town that you remember?
Well, Richard Rainey certainly was one. I don't want to make an attribution to someone who didn't say or do what I think.
Yeah, I know it's been 50 years has been a long time to
But
remember specifics.
There was a significant support in the community, and I can't come up with the names.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you, what kind of, do you have a sense that the ordinance wasn't, other than obviously the realtors had concerns about it, but that it wasn't especially controversial and that there was kind of general community support for it once it was passed?
I don't remember any great controversy. I'm sure, I can't imagine that anything that came before the city commission didn't have some
Right.
controversial aspect to it.
Do you think the ordinance, from your perspective as the, assistant city attorney, the prosecutor, and ultimately as the city attorney, do you have a sense that it had a positive impact, if not right away, over time?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Some of the practices that were engaged in before the ordinance was adopted, and even in the early days after the adoption, were practices that don't generally exist today. Most people in the real estate business, and whether they're investors or whether they've got a few properties or they've got large projects, they know what the rules are, and they know that if they're going to get along, they better abide by the rules. Now, sometimes it doesn't matter whether they appreciate the rules or whether it's the fact. The question is, do they understand and apply the rules as they're written? And it seems that there's been a fair acceptance across the board to follow the law. It's pretty hard to win if you got people who are witnesses to some discriminatory act, and so you got other things to do besides be involved in trying to resist something that exists and is not going to go away.
Right.
At least that's my view of it.
Yeah. Do you recall any fair housing cases coming before you, or do you feel like compliance was pretty widespread after the ordinance was passed?
Oh, no, I think it became more widespread as time evolved. I recall a case in the past 10 years, I suppose, where we had litigation. And again, this is one of those mixed marriage situations. The wife of one color, white, assumed would be the appropriate person to come forth and rent the property. And then they started to move in. The black husband showed up, and the realtor, who I believe did or may still live in the Deep South, took exception and said he wasn't going to let them in. Well, that creates litigation. And we finally, after really a good many hours, a good many days of legal combat, if you will, we ultimately got the appropriate order, and there were sanctions that were imposed, and I don't know what happened after I left the practice, but I assume that there was some substantial compliance with the law, which ended the case. But I'm sure there are others that are going on.
Right, right.
A lot of times I found that even though it may not have been my position to do so, I'd get the parties together or get them on a phone call and see if we couldn't work things out. Fortunately, emails were not excessively used in those days. I wouldn't allow our clients to use email today.
Sometimes wonder how we survived without, even
Very good, very well.
across the course of my career as I was a career military officer, but started off with there was no such thing as email, and then by the end of my career, we couldn't do business any other way. So you sometimes wonder, how did we do business before we had it? But we seem to do quite well.
Yeah.
You've already talked throughout your interview about various experiences you had in the late 60s, early 70s with some of the violence and unrest in Lawrence. But any other stories or recollections that you'd like to share about that time period?
Oh, I don't know. I thought of one that every matter that is serious sometimes has a funny side to it. I recall on a warm summer day and sometime in the 60s, I had my uniform of the day, which was a blue suit, white shirt, probably a red tie, and I was walking around the area of 9th and Vermont Street. There were some women who were out, I suppose, shopping or getting ready to, and I noted their presence, and then I heard this vocal outburst from group of young guys, and they were vulgar statements and loud, and at the same time my eye caught a police car, and I waved to the police to come over. The policeman got out and said, what can I do for you? And I told him what I had observed, and so he called the boys over, and he said, you guys are always doing something stupid. But he said, you've really reached a peak today because you did it in front of the prosecutor. This one kid responded immediately. He said, prosecutor? He said, I thought he was the trash man. I immediately had to leave. I started laughing, and I didn't want to do that in their presence. So.
One thing that, as we've done research for this project, certainly in the mid-1960s, when some studies were done, Lawrence was a fairly segregated community in terms of the areas where African Americans lived. But to what extent do you think that segregation contributed to racial unrest?
Oh, I'm sure that it was significant. I haven't lived in their circumstances, but I have lived in poor circumstances where I was part of the Dust Bowl generation, if you will, and I know that with no money and place to live that's not very accommodating, it's not very pleasant, that you sometimes have a bad attitude. So that I grew up with those circumstances. Again, I'm not trying to relate that I know what these people have suffered or have lived through, but I think that in the back, hidden in the depth of some of these people, they've repressed a lot of these emotions. And when the 60s came along, the demonstrations and all gave them an opportunity to open those repressed feelings and start to express them. And the Jim Crow law was prominent. We had all the issues of the South that were more prevalent than they were here, even though we may have been more repressive than they were in the South. I had a particular, my second tour at Fort Benning, I was married. In fact, I got married and took off on orders to Fort Benning the same day. But the wife was finishing up her degree by mail, not email, and had a young lady from Alabama who was brought in just a smashed group of people into an old truck, and they let them off. And anyway, she once in a while came in to clean up things, and I thought that was horrible. I think the going rate was 35 cents an hour. Even that was cheap, even for a second lieutenant's salary. I gave her a little extra occasionally, and also would try to give her things that we weren't going to use anymore in the food line. And I got contacted, but the driver of the truck said, "Don't do that." And I said, "Look, you drive your truck. If she works here, I'll do what I want to do." But that was a problem, and if you haven't seen it, you can't believe it.
Right.
And this was a very, very common occurrence that come from Phoenix City, Alabama, across the Chattahoochee River there into Columbus and into Fort Benning, and bringing these carloads of what I guess they called them servants at the time. But,
Right. Would you say, from your many years of perspective that you had through your time as assistant city attorney, prosecutor, and then once you became the city attorney for many years after the 1960s, would you say that both the positive changes, things like the fair housing ordinance, the public swimming pool, but also some of the obviously more negative experiences like the unrest of the late 60s, early 70s, did all those things in combination make Lawrence, as painful as some of them were, a better community coming out the other end, or did you see positive changes that resulted from that period?
sure you do. People who weren't here at the time wouldn't recognize them, but this isn't the community that it was at that time. We were, surprisingly to a lot of people, we were kind of a sleepy college town. We've grown, and with growth you have problems that you have to address. It's just growth. It's just the nature of the beast, I think. But overall, I think that we wouldn't be the community we are today if we hadn't adopted such things as fair housing, if there hadn't been other laws enacted either by Congress or by the state or by the city addressing problems of a general nature for all communities, all people. We wouldn't be near the community we are today. Sure, we got our problems. I think right now it's a nation or a worldwide problem what we're experiencing, which is very mindful to me of what took place back in the 60s and 70s. But it'll be resolved. Hopefully it'll be without any more violence. I know that's an expectation that won't occur, but without great violence and without great loss of life. But it'll end. There will be a period of quietness, and something else will be a problem. So, but overall, Lawrence is a great town. It was a lot easier when I could ride my moped to the office. I wouldn't dare get on one today, but the
Some
traffic.
of those college students still do, though.
I've got two grandchildren that drive a little different than what I would advise, but stay out of the way of those people.
Right. Well, Mr. Cooley, I've come to the end of my questions. I just wanted to offer you, if you have any other thoughts about anything we didn't cover that you wanted to share.
Well, it's been rather rambling. I suppose my offering is simply one that's lived longer than would be expected.
Well, thank you very much. This was a very useful interview, and I think we got some great perspectives from you, and you played a central role in a lot of these issues, and so we really appreciate the fact that you lent us your time to share some of your memories. So thank you very much.
I think it's important that we keep our history evolving.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Okay.